Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, to vaccinate now or to wait? We take a look at the issues keeping Australians up at night, and here's a hint, it's not border closures. The Coalition takes a victory lap after the Nationals win a crucial by-election. The question now, is Labor losing its grasp on the blue-collar vote? And mice on the move have warnings about the rodent plague invading Sydney been overblown. Joining me on the panel tonight, Non-Executive Director and Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, Wendy Machin. Good to see you.
Hi Ellen, nice to be here.
In Tamworth, GP and Director of the University of Newcastle's Department of Rural Health, Dr Jenny May. Thanks for being with us, Jenny.
My pleasure.
In Canberra, economist and former Labor Minister Craig Emerson. Good to have you with us again, Craig.
Thanks, Ellen.
And in Perth, Nyungar Cultural Advisor at Curtin University, Ingrid Cumming. Wonderful to meet you, Ingrid.
Kaya Yanuna Kai, how are you?
Good to see you. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Now, Australia's vaccine rollout is slowly picking up steam. The average daily doses administered has risen by about 10,000 in the last week, and the government is now looking ahead to what a partially vaccinated population might look like. The idea of a vaccine passport is being floated. That could help enable both domestic and international travel.
The DPD will have the capability to validate the vaccination status of people who have been vaccinated in Australia when they return from overseas. This could support Australians' ability to travel without the need for 14 days quarantine on return.
But when it comes to opening up, it seems that for most Australians there's no rush. The ABC has released the first results from its Australia Talks national survey of 60,000 Australians. Now, they were asked a series of COVID-related questions, and the results revealed that 79% of Australians believe we should keep our international borders shut until the pandemic is under control globally. 70% believe freedom sometimes needs to be restricted to keep us safe. That's a rise of 16% from last year. And 85% of us agree all Australians who can safely get a COVID vaccine should do so. And more than half of us think it should be mandatory. For more on this, we're joined by ABC political writer and commentator and the host of Australia Talks, Annabelle Crabb. Hi, Annabelle.
Hello, Ellen.
What does this tell us about our national character, that almost half of us want to pin down those who are hesitant about vaccines and forcibly jab them in the arm?
Yes, well, it's a bit at odds with what we'd like to think our national character is, I think. I mean, all of these associations we have from our past with these wonderful larrikin figures, and we like to think of ourselves as a sort of small battler country with a, mid-level problem with petty authority figures. But actually this data tells us that we are absolutely the reverse of that person. What we really like is nice crunchy rules and being told what to do. And, it's nearly 2 years since we did the last Australia Talks survey. And I've got to say, I wondered, will things have changed enough in that time to make a second survey worthwhile? But wow, this virus has really made all of these changes to the way that we think and exacerbated a few low-lying existing tendencies to a really interesting degree. So when we see, for instance, the Prime Minister, talking about the importance of keeping the international borders very secure, you can see from this data that he's kind of working with the population of Australia to a really significant degree. So we think 8 in 10 of us think that the international borders should just remain closed until everything's fixed. There's
it's fixed globally.
Right. So, if you think back on the conversations we've been having about Australians trying to get back home and, the ban on travel from India and so on, this is the baseline, what people think. It's just keep everybody out. So, it's worked very well for state leaders as well. One of the other really clear trends coming out of the first batch of information that we have from 60,000 respondents on Australia Talks is that there's been a really across-the-board approval of how governments at both levels have handled COVID. I mean, the federal government is writing about a 67% approval rate. All of the state governments and territory governments are higher than that. The highest rate of approval is in South Australia and Western Australia, where 90% of respondents reckon that their state governments did a good job. The lowest of the state governments is Victoria, but on 70%, which is, you know, pretty much fantasy realm for approval ratings for any government of the age. So we do really approve of the way our governments have been handling it, and particularly the ones that have been enacting really strong border restrictions.
Yeah.
So that's what we like. We like to be told where to line up and who can go where and who can't.
It's really interesting, isn't it, Craig? 70% believe freedom sometimes needs to be restricted. 85% of us say we should get a vaccine. Do you want to just free associate with me for a moment, Craig? Can I do that to you?
Sounds like fun.
Okay.
Let's do that.
I'm going to tell you a joke. How
Right.
do you get Canadians out of a cool, clean pool on a stifling hot day, Craig?
Okay, this has got something to do with the Canadian accent, but
Canadian
got me.
identity. Okay, the answer is you stand up and you say, OK, everyone out of the pool.
right.
It turns out, Craig, this is an
Are they-
Australian joke
are they very
as well.
compliant?
They are
Right,
very
right.
compliant, as are we. What does that do to our sense of identity? Forget Crocodile Dundee. We're all kind of latent Canadians.
I don't know that we'd all jump out of the pool if Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese said get out of the pool. They'd probably bring him into the pool. But on once in a 100-year pandemics, it is true that Australians like rules, and we saw, as was mentioned, the real live experiment with this with Mark McGowan in particular. You might recall he just said, no, the border's shut. And there was a challenge, a High Court challenge from Clive Palmer that was initially joined by the federal government, Christian Porter. And I think Scott Morrison saw the danger of that and pulled that association with Palmer out. And of course, in the state election, the McGowan government was returned with such a majority that the Liberal Party barely exists in that parliament. I'm pretty sure Scott Morrison saw that. He saw what happened in Queensland as well with Anastasia Palaszczuk, who did come under criticism from some federal ministers but stood her ground and won with an increased majority. And they're not the only two states, but the message to him he has obviously heard. I don't know if he got a sneak preview of the ABC survey, I doubt it, but he would have been getting that from his own focus groups. And so his language has changed. I don't know if people have noticed in the last week. We're not opening up until we're absolutely sure and we're ready. That's obviously what the people want to hear.
Yeah. Wendy, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you haven't been vaccinated.
No.
Why is that?
Well, I guess I reflect a lot of the population. I think we need to be vaccinated, but I don't feel at risk myself. I'm not planning to go anywhere. I have no reason to go overseas, and it's hard to go overseas anyway. I'm not in contact with people who are travelling overseas. I'm healthy. I've been probably looking at the news and the coverage about AstraZeneca in particular, which is supposed to be perfectly okay for my age group, and my head tells me statistically blood clots happen a lot in the community, but the publicity sort of saying blood clot and AstraZeneca in the same sentence, I think is just causing a lot of people, giving them reason to pause and think about whether or not they'll do it. I know a lot of people in my age group are now waiting to get access to the Pfizer vaccine, and that's becoming more accessible. So I think it's the right thing to do. I'm just watching and waiting. I'm looking at the research. I'm talking to all my friends that have had the vaccine to see how did you feel, did you have any side effects, and it's varied.
Just a quick yes, no. If the Prime Minister came out and said, right, the borders are going to open on this date, would your hesitancy dissolve and you'd...
Yes, I think it would.
OK. And Jenny, they're in the catch-22. We can't open until folks are vaccinated.
Wendy.
And we can't vaccinate until we're going to open.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So Wendy demonstrates a combination of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine complacency. And I think one of the problems is that the strategy and the politics is feeding into some confusion for patients on the ground. And what I hear Wendy saying is very much what I hear my patients saying here in regional Australia, which is, well, there's no urgency, why should I? And yet our experience is that it's very much more sensible to get vaccinated prior to a COVID outbreak than during. And I think our experience just recently in Victoria in the last 12 hours suggesting an outbreak potentially in Victoria is a really good reminder that putting off vaccination is definitely not a good idea. I think the second thing is that the choice to vaccinate is a choice on an individual level, but it's also a choice on behalf of others. And if Wendy wants to go to the nursing home and see elderly relatives, and if Wendy has friends who are on chemo and immunocompromised, then Wendy choosing to vaccinate is going to be a really positive thing to reduce the exposure of COVID to those immunosuppressed individuals. So I really, I understand, I absolutely understand, and I hear that confusion in the message, and I really hope that we can work with people to access vaccination, which is available now, and AstraZeneca is a safe and effective vaccine to be used in the over 50s, and really encourage people to get on with the job.
Ingrid, in New South Wales, the immunisation program is really ramping up. You know, there's a lot of times you're hearing people talk about, I'm going on Saturday, I'm going on Tuesday. A friend of mine said she got actually quite emotional after getting her Pfizer jab. She's under 50, because suddenly she thought, gosh, this is what we've all been talking about for the last, year or so. Are those conversations happening in WA?
We've been very lucky over here. I guess if lucky is the word you can use. We've not had maybe some of the circumstances you've seen on the East Coast because of state daddy, as we love to call him over here, our Premier having a pretty hardline approach. But I think a lot of people, it's totally dependent on people's circumstance. So, my grandmother who passed away about 1.5 years ago, if this was all happening, I would have definitely got the jab so I could be with her while she was ill. But, for me, there's no real urgency, and I think people are just trying to suss out, based on their circumstance, whether it's something they want to do or not, because we have such low cases and transmission over here. So I think we've got a bit more freedom of choice of which way we want to go, and I think that's appropriate.
It's interesting. Sorry, go on. Who was that?
Oh, that was me. This is Annabelle just chiming in. Ingrid, I just really want Ingrid to talk us through this whole state daddy thing, because the rest of us think that is so freaky that you call him that. Ingrid, I demand that you explain how this came to be.
I believe it's something from TikTok, but it's one of those sort of urban dialogues that are going around. He's been the guy that's stood firm and shown real leadership to say that as far as West Australia is concerned, the best thing for us is to keep the borders closed and to keep WA people safe. So, and also too with our First Nations communities, we've seen very low to little cases of COVID, and with people who are unfortunately the circumstances we are with being a high risk group, that's just been such a fantastic outcome, So I think State Daddy is an affectionate way of us thanking him for such leadership in a time of such uncertainty.
But so, Annabelle,
when I see him, I won't say hello, Premier. I say hello, State Daddy.
Oh, that's
like a lot of fun.
That's weird.
But Annabelle, okay, so we're being told to go get vaccinated. How does that square with the notion that we're compliant Canadians who do as we are told?
Well, because seriously, the health minister was on the radio the other day saying, I understand that some people are waiting for the Pfizer vaccine. There's been this. So if I can borrow the term state daddy and just apply it generally, because we always freak out about the nanny state, but this is the daddy state that we've all been kind of learning to love over the last 1.5 years, right? Like this idea that big decisions by governments will keep us safe. Now, that is a super tempting way to look at the relationship with government, but it also means that your own decision-making muscles get a little bit atrophied because you think, well, State Daddy will take care of it. So what does State Daddy say about getting vaccinated? Well, our State Daddy told us that, I'll stop saying State Daddy because it's just odd now, but, our government said, well, look, everyone will be vaccinated by, this date, and then the vaccine rollout didn't really happen, and then that wasn't a problem, but then it was, and then something happened with AstraZeneca. There was sort of dramatic late-night press conferences, and then, well, there's this other vaccine. The actual message about what you need to do right now has been nowhere as clear as the, you know, you must all wear masks, you can't go here, you can only have 5 people in your house or whatever that we saw during the actual active phase of the virus. I mean, it's still active, but you know what I mean. So I actually think that the message from the daddy state has been much more blurry about the vaccine. And what you see in recent days is the Prime Minister sort of stepping up this idea that you could have rewards for being vaccinated. Like if you get vaccinated, you could have greater freedom of movement. And I don't know whether that would get Wendy over the edge. I suspect that if Wendy...
I feel so guilty.
No, don't feel bad.
I've been so guilty. I have to absolutely say I'm going to get vaccinated. I just haven't, because partly availability, partly just waiting to see you know, which vaccine looks best for me. I'm absolutely pro-vaccination.
But also the cold hard reality, Wendy, is everybody woke up tomorrow and said they wanted to be vaccinated, who was eligible to be vaccinated.
We couldn't do it.
We don't have enough vaccine.
No.
Let me just come to you finally, Jenny. The Health Minister, quote, right now we want to encourage everybody over 50, like Wendy and I, to be vaccinated as early as possible, but we've been very clear that as supply increases later on in the year, there'll be enough mRNA vaccine for every Australian. In other words, if you hang on, you can get Pfizer. Is Annabelle right? Has there been mixed messaging on this? Is that what your patients say?
That is what my patients say, and I think I'm very clear that the communication strategy around the vaccination hasn't been to the standard we want, and I will take responsibility that it's interesting that my discussions with patients aren't getting them across the line.
Are they?
So there are elements. Well, no, they're. I'm getting responses just like Wendy gave us that no, they're fully intending to, but now's not the right time. And I think we've really got to think about it. It's really interesting, isn't it? They are safe and efficacious vaccines. I would suggest that you don't know what Fluvax you got, you don't know what the brand was, and yet there is incredible brand awareness around COVID vaccination. And I think that's really interesting because you know, as I said, we get other drugs, we get other vaccines, and it hasn't required the degree of scrutiny that we are now applying to our COVID vaccines. And I'm all for people participating in their healthcare, but there is a point at which we do need to understand risk and take expertise. And I think our regulators have been very open and accountable and provided as much clear information as they can, but the communication therefore about how and where and when we should be vaccinated has not been as clear.
Gee, it was fun to have you on the program, Annabelle. I missed when Ingrid said, what was it, State Daddy?
State Daddy.
I think that's very interesting. You've got a wonderful antenna. You're going to come back and talk to us about other things in the Australian Talk survey in the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely going to bore your socks off with Australia Talks data. Stand by, I'll be back.
Thanks so much for that, Annabelle. Annabelle Crabb, the host of Australia Talks. The Pied Pipers of Sydney can put down their flutes. Experts have dismissed predictions that a plague of rodents is headed to the big city, but that will be little solace for those in regional New South Wales and Queensland who've spent months terrorised by hundreds of thousands of mice. The hope is now that cooler weather will start to slow down the plague, which has already caused millions of dollars worth of damage. And a warning, if you're even a little bit squeamish, look away now.
A mouse plague in parts of regional New South Wales is causing health concerns.
It's scenes like this that have farmers at a crisis point.
Wow.
At night, you can hear and even smell them. By dawn, the damage is done.
Farmers are spending thousands on poison, but it's making little difference.
The smell, the stench, you never get used to it.
All of our traditional control measures have failed to make a dent.
Schools are being impacted. There are mice eating through electrical cords. We've got mice in cots.
3 hospital patients have been bitten in Walgett, Canamble and here in Glargenbone.
I was on my iPod watching TikTok and one came up and bit me.
Not even the toilet paper is safe.
The milk
which is in plastic, then in a box. They ate through the box and then into the plastic of the milk.
Even cats have given up trying to control this plague.
That'd be my cat. Can you even buy mouse traps in New South Wales anymore?
Well, my farm is in Wingham, which is on the coast, on the mid-north coast, so it's not nearly as badly affected, but there are mice there, and for some months now my local supermarket has not had mouse traps and many mouse baits, so I've just been... Yesterday I went and bought a whole load of naphthalene and stuff like that, and I thought I'll just sprinkle that around the place to keep them out of the bed.
Right.
Yeah, because they were in the bed having a party, clearly.
So you've got some... Sorry, I'm getting on itching myself involuntarily. You should have seen Ingrid's face during that package. You haven't got anything like that in the West, have you? Wheat belt? God, you wouldn't want that.
No, someone told me a story about how they found a mouse the other day, but certainly not to the degree we're seeing here.
And you're right in literally the thick of it, aren't you, Jenny, in Tamworth?
Oh, we certainly are, and my heart goes out to the farmers and those who are watching their crops and their stock and their silos infected or infested. And certainly for us who are, I guess, on the edge of town or townies, it's incredibly inconvenient and tiresome. And just to give you an idea, I was talking to one of my colleagues who was playing hockey on Friday night at our local hockey stadium and discovered to their horror that they might have been batting mice around rather than hockey balls. So, you know, I mean, they're all over the road, they're all over everywhere. I had to harvest 20 in my laundry over the weekend. It's tiresome, it's inconvenient, it's unpleasant.
Now on the screen. Oh.
And I can tell you that the stench is the really biggest turn-off. I mean, one thing, the conversation in the tea room is about people's incredible inventions and capacities to make homemade mousetraps, because you're right, buying, you know, mouse and rat bait is just about impossible. So everybody's thinking internally, you know, how can sultanas work, or peanut butter, or, you know, whether blue cheese is the best, but it's got to be scaled. I mean, I think that's the big message. We're seeing mice and mice upon mice.
I heard a good one yesterday. A guy up at Wigan was telling me that they used to put a string up into a bucket, and in this case you'd probably have to do a 44-gallon drum of water, and you scatter a bit of grain on top of the water, and then the mice climbs up the string and they fall in the water, they can't get out, and they eventually drown. It sounds really inventive. I don't know if that's one that people have tried, but it sounded kind of non-poisonous but effective. But you'd need a big drum, I think. I mean, I agree with Jenny. It's an inconvenience for me, but for people who've waited years for a drought to break to get a fantastic crop only to see it destroyed by those mice, that's just heartbreaking for them.
It's been extraordinary, hasn't it? Fire and drought and plague.
And now, plague of mice, plague across the world. It's impacted, you know, business as well. So, you know, there's a real mental health issue out there. People, it's just kind of the last straw for many people. Just when they thought they got a break, this happens.
You're watching The Drama, and with me on the panel, Non-Executive Director and Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, Wendy Machin; in Tamworth, GP and Director of the University of Newcastle's Department of Rural Health, Dr Jenny May; economist and former Labor Minister Craig Emerson; and in Perth, Nyungar Cultural Advisor at Curtin University, Ingrid Cumming. Now, politicians are experts at taking single election results and divining all sorts of conclusions from them, and that's certainly been the case with Saturday's by-election in the New South Wales seat of the Upper Hunter. According to the Coalition, the Nationals' victory there is evidence that Labor has lost its grip on the blue-collar vote. Speaking before the result was final, the Prime Minister claimed that Labor was being punished for its opposition to a government-funded gas-fired power plant in the region.
I think Labor has completely lost touch in the Hunter Valley, and I think they've abandoned them. I think they've been given a message that somehow they're collateral damage when it comes to those climate change policies. I totally just don't buy that.
And it's a view shared by Joel Fitzgibbon, the federal Labor member for the seat of Hunter.
A lot of our base walked away from us some time ago now, and it's clear that they haven't returned. You won't get them back quickly or easily. The reality is, we heard it on the weekend, they are sceptical of us, if not suspicious. And of course, that suspicion is only fuelled by decisions made late or on the eve of the by-election to oppose the gas generator in the Hunter Valley, a $600 million investment. They just shake their heads and say, we thought so.
But Labor leader Anthony Albanese says he's unwilling to read too much into it.
This is a seat that Labor has not held in the last 9 decades at any time whatsoever. This is a seat whereby, frankly, a couple of elections ago, we would have struggled to find people to hand out how to vote in.
Craig, no government has had a swing towards it in a by-election in a decade. Labor suffered a 7.3 swing away from it in this election. Did New South Wales Labor give the people of the Upper Hunter any reason to vote for them?
I think the stage at which New South Wales Labor is at is it hasn't really got into policy development and putting propositions to the voters, and that is, you know, a period in which this by-election has occurred. So,
well, that's their job, isn't it? Her Majesty's opposition.
Well, there are two jobs in opposition. One is to hold the government to account, and the other is to develop alternative policies. And I'm saying that I don't think that policy development stage is as advanced as maybe it should be, but I don't accept the arguments that are being put that this is all about, or importantly, about a gas-fired power station that would work for no more than 2% of the year and employ about 10 to 20 people. And if you look at the climate change policies, emission reduction policies of the New South Wales government, it's one of the most progressive in Australia. With Machin, you know, they've been talking about renewable energy and renewable energy zones and the whole. If that was the heart of the issue, there would have been a swing under the Joel Fitzgibbon analysis and that of others, including the Prime Minister. There would have been a swing against the coalition.
But doesn't that just demonstrate,
Craig?
Doesn't that just demonstrate that the New South Wales coalition has worked out how to have Matt Keane talk about renewable energy zones, the Environment Minister in New South Wales, and John Barilaro and the National Party talking to the people of the Upper Hunter about coal jobs, and they found a way to do that with some consistency, and that's what Labor hasn't been able to do.
Yeah, I think that's fair comment. I actually think that's fair comment. But, you know, suddenly this state by-election is now a test for the federal parliamentary Labor Party, whereas a full state election in Western Australia and in Queensland, also the Northern Territory, where state Labor governments were returned, and in Western Australia, the Liberal Party almost disappeared from the parliament, from the state parliament. That had no federal implications whatsoever. A by-election, really important. A whole state election with decisive wins to Labor, no, not really relevant. So look, we know all the games that are played here. The victor says, oh, it's got these wider implications. The loser says it doesn't. I'm just trying to answer directly. I think that to answer your question, I think it's true that you have the Matt Keanes and the John Barilaros. Probably they've knitted that together. I suspect they're not the closest of friends, but that doesn't really matter. They've got a story, and I think it's important for the state Labor Party to develop a story about its policies. There's still time to do that, but I think that's a legitimate part of the criticism of the result. And no one's going to say there's no lessons for anyone in this whatsoever. It's just that, as Lindsay Tanner once said, in politics, everything is exaggerated.
Wendy, I know you've been on the polling, but let me just turn to Ingrid if I can, because you're in a state where Labor romped it in. I mean, are there still two Liberals? Did they ever get a third in the state parliament? I think they had exact gender parity on two, one man and one woman.
Look, I couldn't tell you much about the Liberal government because, again, they just lost a lot of weight over here, and because the Labor government has shown some, pretty strong leadership, particularly over the last, 12 months with COVID, everyone just wanted to stick with what they knew, obviously, knowing that, whatever they're doing is working. So, for me, it's reflective of, the particular government in power. Are they listening? Are they engaging? And are they making decisions based on what West Australians need? So clearly, I think that's why Labor had such a landslide victory, because clearly that's happening. So.
Okay, so two Liberals in the lower house in WA, but does that translate for you from your reading of the situation into West Australians' views of federal Labor? Are they as enthusiastic for federal Labor, or are they very much drawing a distinction between the two?
Well, I can only really, speak for myself on that one. But, if state Labor is doing such a good job, we would hope that the federal Labor government would, have a good relationship and a good dialogue with Western Australia to make sure they're doing the same thing across Australia. And, Liberals federally, there are questions being asked at the moment, isn't there, about that leadership and which way we want to go. So I think hopefully the federal Labor government will be just as willing to listen and to engage for the good of all Australians in every state and territory, like our WA government has done over here.
Wendy, this is heartland for you, isn't it? This is where you...
Yes, it's where I grew up. It's where I first represented, so it was fantastic to see the result.
And you were on the booths.
Yeah.
What were people saying about the things that were motivating their vote?
Well, I was on the booth in Gloucester, which is at the northern end of the electorate. So it's interesting, the town of Gloucester was very rural. It's only a small town of about 2,500 people, but over the years, the mining has sort of crept up from the lower Hunter Valley, and it's had a big impact. You can see the money that's gone into the town. So you can see that the town has benefited from people earning good money out of the mines. It's not to say that it's not controversial. There was also a significant Green presence, not that they polled very well. It was quite a disappointing result for the Greens, but there were a lot of people who were obviously local supporters of the Greens. So it's a little bit divisive.
And what were they saying about their voting intentions? Because the New South Wales Labor leader said she was sort of shocked and surprised by the result.
A lot of people on booths don't comment, they'll brush past you. It's really funny. We'd run a book about who are they going to vote for, because it's quite good spirit on the polling booths with the other parties by and large. But the people who did comment, there was clearly strong support for the Liberal National Government and its incumbency. So I think that's sort of what we're seeing in the other states.
That's what Ingrid
those
said.
Strong votes, yeah. And I think it's parochialism to a certain extent. It's state premiers being seen to keep their states safe. And you said earlier in the program, there is the same perception of the federal government. So there were comments about, yes, we want to keep the government in power. There were comments about the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian. There were a couple of people who would go by and say, what is Dave Lasell's view on mining? And I would say, well, he supports responsible mining, and say, right, I'm voting for you. So it was important to people. And I think to take it a little bit broader, I think I agree with what Craig is saying, that it's not wise to always say that this happened in a by-election or one state, therefore that will extrapolate across the whole country. My view is that people, the voters are smarter than that, and they will differentiate between state and federal elections and the issues. But this was a seat where Labor just wasn't cutting through, and they haven't, and I do think there's a real problem for them. And I think, as John Barilaro has said, there's a perception in the country that country people feel they are paying the price for what people want in the cities. And much of Labor's vote comes out of the cities, and they kind of don't know which way to go. They're trying to keep sweet with the sort of greener, left-leaning city people who are sometimes now seen as more elite. And then when you go up to a seat like Upper Hunter, it's, hey, suddenly we're coal miners. Our candidate's a coal miner, support him. And people see you can't have it both ways. So Labor's got to figure out, I guess to your point, Craig, they've got to figure out a policy position on energy and a few other things and be clear about it. And I just think, people could see through that.
Jenny?
So I'm at the top end of the electorate. I'm not in the Upper Hunter, but I'm about 70 kilometres from the northern end of the electorate, and I absolutely agree with what Wendy just said. But I'd take it even further and say I think that much of the interest is actually about local issues, and the sense in which I thought that there was a lot of disengagement with the political process and some cynicism. So when there were the announcements in the last 2 weeks prior to the election, I heard from my friends and colleagues that they felt that was quite disingenuous, and they hadn't seen the product of that, I guess, that interest up till now. So I think that there's a real message for both parties in this, that in fact it may not translate both to a national or to a state level. And I think it did represent Gladys Berejiklian's management of the health crisis in New South Wales, and I think that's the main issue that people voted on. I think that jobs are a huge issue in rural communities, and security of jobs and a job's future is really important. And I don't think either party has actually come to grips with that to the extent that they could expect loyalty from local communities such as the Upper Hunter.
Well, one of the other things that came up quite a lot was roads. I mean, you'd expect that in a big country seat. Upper Hunter's a really big seat with a lot of roads. So roads got a big mention, and it generally does in most country elections. But the other thing, if you go and look at the announcements made, there weren't a lot of huge, at the state level, huge, big spending election promises. And that was a deliberate strategy because I think, to the point you just made, people can see what that means. So it was a very grassroots campaign. The Nationals had a really good candidate. He was a local guy, a great campaigner, a good speaker, just a really nice guy. And he got around, he worked really hard. And everybody who met him said he's a really nice bloke. And that rippled out. So that was kind of the reputation. Dave's a really nice guy. You know, he was called Dave. His posters all said Dave. And there was a fantastic turnout of volunteers and Nationals on the ground. All the pre-poll booths were covered. You know, there were multiple people there every day for the couple of weeks leading up to the election. We had 400 people on the ground on Saturday. So it was a really good grassroots campaign.
And just really briefly, did you see that many numbers of volunteers from Labor and the Greens and One Nation? Were there a lot of other people, or were you outnumbering the other folks?
I think we outnumbered them.
Okay.
There were a lot of people working there, but a lot of them came from further away.
Okay. Just a quick question, if I can, to you, Craig. If we could think more broadly about this, and this question that you've acknowledged, that Labor's got this problem of being seen to say one thing in the city and another thing in outer suburban and regional areas, which was certainly the critique after the last federal election. A quote from Greg Sheridan in The Australian. He's their foreign editor. Over the past decade, political parties in Western societies have changed places. The centre-right parties now represent low-income earners, tradies, manual workers and those without a university degree. The centre-left parties represent high-income earners, graduates and those who sit atop the services sector. Is this what we're seeing here, Craig?
Well, that is to an extent true around the world. And we saw it in the US, for example. Donald Trump's support base was basically those who'd not gone to college or university, and Joe Biden's support base was those who had. But that doesn't mean, in order to win an election, I'm going to say something very obvious here. In Australia, the whole difference between winning and losing is about 48% and 52%. So that the idea that all university people vote Labor and all working class people vote Liberal is just not true. And Bob Hawke used to say publicly and to me all the time, mate, don't underestimate the intelligence of the Australian people. The reason I raise this, I do not believe that there is a problem of Labor, for example, on energy transition, that this is somehow some elite issue, and coal miners in the Hunter Valley have no idea that there's a problem about the future of coal mining. There is. And that is not because the Australian government jumps up and down and insists that we must continue to sell coal. It's a question as to whether people will continue to buy coal. And I think the right conversation with them is that there's a transition going on and there will be more renewable energy, but that renewable energy can be brought into your areas to the coal-fired power stations, then distributed into the cities. In other words, you have a secure future during and at the end of this energy transition.
That's a conversation
who leads I think we should be having in.
Who leads that conversation? Because I was reminded today that Bob Hawke's electorate of Wills, many of his constituents were textile workers. So Hawke and Keating reduced the tariffs on clothing and footwear coming into Australia. The local manufacturing goes kaput, and the textile voters presumably keep voting in sufficient numbers for the local member that Bob Hawke doesn't lose his seat. So is that the problem, that no one in Labor knows how to speak to both the inner cities and the blue collars in the same way that, that Hawke could take people along?
There's something to that, but Bob didn't live in the digital age, and he used to say, oh, you know, if you say something to so-and-so, they might say it to so-and-so, and you say, Bob, you know, there's all these things like television and things like that these days. Well, now it's very digital, and it's easier said than done to get out on the stump everywhere, but I think it is a legitimate challenge, and I think it's one that voters are up for. If you level with them, And I do think Labor is saying that. Labor's not saying we are going to end coal mining, we are going to cost you your jobs. But people know that some of these fossil fuel industries don't have a great future into the long term. And the question is how to make the transition where it is relevant such that they have job security. That's the challenge, but it's also the truth.
Today marks a year since mining giant Rio Tinto destroyed a sacred rock shelter in Western Australia. The Juukan Gorge, an Aboriginal heritage site, contained evidence of 46,000 years of continued human habitation and priceless Indigenous artefacts. As yet, there's still no guarantee that similar acts of destruction won't occur again. The West Australian Government has refused to commit to a moratorium on the destruction of future sites, although Aboriginal heritage laws are being promised in the second half of this year. Negotiations to compensate the traditional owners are ongoing, but representatives say the loss is irreplaceable.
No amount of money will ever replace that. Nothing. I'd rather have the rock shelter back than you write me a cheque. That's how I feel about it.
Ingrid, there was an outcry around the world. Do you think traditional owners such as yourself in Western Australia have more power today than you had a year ago because of this terrible act of destruction?
It's terrible that something like this has to happen to have such a global reaction to it, isn't it? And it's not the first. And, sadly, I hate to say, I don't see it never happening again. And I think that's where the West Australian Government does need to take that leadership, in particular in relation to firming up that Heritage Act and the conditions of how people live, work and basically obtain resources within areas which are known to be heritage, because it wasn't an unknown. It was known what was in that place, and yet somehow the issue still went forward. However, it is an opportunity as well to flip the narrative, to really look at how things are going down in the resource sector and how we can improve that. And I think many in the resource sector know that they are definitely on notice now in relation to firming up their strategies on how they go about their business.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's been talk for decades in Western Australia about this thing called Section 18, right? So you've got the rules and then you've got Section 18. So the mining company can put in a Section 18 application for permission to destroy or impact an Aboriginal heritage site. Now, they could do that tomorrow. That could happen tomorrow. I think it's happened a couple of times since, hasn't it?
That's right. And I think former Minister Ben Wyatt said it pretty well in relation to, just because it's legislatively supported, it doesn't mean, it's the right thing to do or something you should do. And I think that's where that cultural immersion and that truth-telling and that, building that capacity within people working, and whether it be resource sector or any sector for that matter, of how important these things are, why we need to think about them to impact our decision making, is so critical in 2021 and has been critical from day dot.
Yeah, but it was critical in 1991. It seemed like, and we've all had this conversation, but it seemed like people inside Rio were more fluent at having that conversation 20 years ago than they are today. So it sort of speaks to that constant powerlessness, doesn't it, of you're reliant on the best governance inside mining companies, because you've still got the capacity under the West Australian law for them to fill in a bit of paperwork and say, look, we really need to blow this up.
I think that's the power within, the national reconciliation movement, and this particular year's theme around, reconciliation takes action. We do need to talk. We always need to talk and continue the dialogue with our traditional owners, but we also need to think about what is the strategy of how we just don't continually make these mistakes, and also the 60,000 years of knowledge that are within our communities that we're still not leveraging to the point we need to make sure we don't make the same mistakes and we go forward, which is actually taking on both sides of the two worlds. So,
You're remarkably calm when you talk about it and seeing the positive benefits of the future. But what Ingrid has talked about and what the Putu Kuntu Karama Pinakura people are mourning today is not only the loss of the Juukan Caves, but what's been called the torment of our powerlessness. That's one of the achingly mournful phrases in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, produced 4 years ago after an historic meeting of Aboriginal leaders from around Australia. They set forth to give Indigenous Australians a voice, a treaty, and to tell the truth about our history, to do what the British failed to do in the first place. Historian Henry Reynolds' new book, Truth Telling, scours the historical record to discover that the need for this reckoning was acknowledged all the way back in the months after Captain Arthur Phillip first raised the flag at Botany Bay. Henry joins me from Hobart now. Wonderful to be talking to you again. I think it's probably 20 years since I've spoken to you. How are you?
Yes, could well be. Yes, I'm fine, thanks.
Showing our age, both of us. So talk to me about, in Trumpian terms, that big lie that the settlers had to wrangle with in the first few months after settlement, when they were told, look, sparsely inhabited population, there's basically no one there.
Yes, well, when they arrived, there were far more people around Sydney than they expected. They also discovered, to their amazement, that there were also people on the Blue Mountains, and that when they started moving out from Sydney, as they did, everywhere they went, there were new small groups, nations of people, often with different languages. So they knew within a couple of years that the ideas that they brought from Britain and the ideas that had been encased in law were simply wrong. And that's not surprising, after all. The plans were made by people in Britain very quickly, because it was after the loss of the American colonies. None of them had ever been there. The only person who could advise them were a couple who had been with Cook, like Sir Joseph Banks. And it's not surprising that they made a mess of it. But they made a mess of it in another important way. That is, they turned their back on at least 150 years of their behaviour in North America, British North America, both Canada and the US. That is, they'd made treaties. They accepted that the Indians were in occupation of their land, and they accepted that the Indians exercised a form of sovereignty over that land. So it was necessary to make treaties, and many, many treaties had been made by the time that the British came to Australia. Now, the critical thing is they did not make treaties in Australia, and that in a way predetermined much of what happened. It predetermined much of the violence, because there was no other way of dealing with things. There was no way to negotiate treaties and negotiate the sale of land, because the assumption was either the Aborigines weren't there or they had no customs and laws, and they had moved. They were people who wandered about willy-nilly, and they had never really attached themselves to the soil.
No, so this is interesting, because what you're talking about, you take your starting point as the Uluru Statement and say, righto, well, let me take you back. And what you're basically saying is, we've known this issue with treaty from colonial times, that you had English identities saying, Australia, you're heading for trouble. For a couple of hundred years now. There was Governor Arthur, who spent 12 years in Tasmania with the Black Wars, overseeing the Black Wars there, saying, look, if you want to settle in Western Australia, where Ingrid is tonight, in South Australia, you'd better do treaty. And then there's a philosopher and social reformer, Jeremy Bentham, back in England, saying very loudly, Australia without treaties, you're always in trouble. And I guess that's a thought I'd never really understood, is if you put the word peace in front of it, Henry, peace treaty, suddenly the lights go on. How do you stop having conflict unless you have a way to make peace?
Yes, exactly. It was, as I say, it was almost inevitable, as people realised, because in a sense the Aboriginal people, the First Nations, had nothing they could bring to the table. They had nothing to treat with, because the British had said from the very start, you don't own your land. And that wasn't changed till Mabo. But the other thing is, you don't have laws and customs, so therefore you don't have a form of sovereignty. So we can't talk to you because you've got nothing to bring to the table.
Ingrid, it's interesting. So I guess you would have learned about settlers when you went through school.
And read a lot of Henry Reynolds in my undergraduate degree as well, believe it or not.
And what impact did that have when you finally got to read Henry?
Well, I mean, growing up, as a young Nyungar girl, you didn't learn about the frontier wars or, the impact of colonialism or any of those sorts of things in any of your schooling. That came when I finally went to university and, went to Curtin University and discovered that learning about Indigenous culture and heritage was actually my big passion. And the experience I'd felt lied to, and I felt, you know, I didn't get the whole story, and the way they're talking about my people is not what I experience as even a young Nyungar woman, even to now. So I guess that for me, that's why I'm so passionate in the work that I do with Curtin University, is to provide, you know, those opportunities for people to engage and do it. And I know we are some of the most patient and understanding people in the world, because we continue to have these narratives, even though we continue to see these things happen. But we do it because of so many years of not being listened to. Like, you know, Henry says, you know, they came here and thought that there was no value, but there was many different types of value, no matter what industry you think of in contemporary day. The Indigenous knowledge, practices and information can have a significant impact on how we, as Australians, all of us, can have better, healthier lives. And through that truth-telling, that's a really important process. So I guess I don't want people to have the same experience, or even my children have the same experience I had, where it's not until their early 20s where they start to really get the true stories. And for a lot of non-Indigenous people that I teach and I work with, too, it's always about, but we didn't know and we didn't realise, and they go through this guilt and this shame. I said, well, you're not much use to us in that realm. Definitely acknowledge, don't forget these yarns, but you know, you have the choice. I guess that's that white privilege. You get the choice to either live in ignorant bliss if you wish, or to take on the stuff that we shared with you and figure out how you can also be part of the progression rather than contribute to the ongoing problem.
Craig, there's another thing that, a comment that Henry made, which is that a lot of the frontier stories, and you grew up in the bush, were about pioneers fighting with the land, not fighting with the owners of the land. That's an interesting observation, isn't it?
It was John Oxley who came around Barradine, Coonabarabran, that area, and we learned a lot about John Oxley and not a lot about the First Nations people around Barradine. But when you're listening to, you know, the conversation we've just heard, we haven't come far, have we? Like, you know, the first settlers come, the British, according to Henry, and it sounds absolutely right, just didn't recognise any rights at all. Who did? Who, in all those years that have since passed, a bunch of judges, the High Court, no politician, no government has done the right thing and recognised a simple reality. And we had to wait for the High Court because, you know, the non-Indigenous community is so kind of disinterested or confused about this that they never saw that it was important. Then there was the Wick case, so that strengthened the nature of the native title. Again, the High Court. And we've done nothing really on land rights. Bob Hawke regarded that as one of his great laments, that he should have done more on land rights. And now we are in a situation where we're still arguing about whether we should have constitutional recognition of the First Nations people in our constitution. It is so obvious that they were here before, that they had rights, they have rights now, and we still are going, oh, gee, I don't know about that. That could be very divisive. Come on, Australia, let's get on with it. This is ridiculous and insulting to the First Nations people.
Henry, talk to me about why the past affects the present. That's what historians do. That's your job. If there is a notion of, oh, well, let's say it wasn't settled, then Australia was conquered. A lot of people will say, well, that's just the horrible reality of colonial power.
Yes, and that's frequently said. Look, we had the power, they didn't, we took the country. But if you press them and say, well, you know, when did it happen? You see, Australia was a mosaic of small self-governing nations with their own languages and traditions. Now, to prove conquest, you'd have to prove how each one of them was conquered, but how do you know when it happened? Because there was no peace treaty to say the fighting was over. You know, conquest might sound like an answer, but it doesn't. It just raises infinitely more problems.
Jenny, often we come to these debates, or maybe we've moved beyond it, of a notion of, you know, either there's an emphasis on practical reconciliation, or there's, you know, an obsession with the past, or that the past informs the present. As a medical practitioner, do you see real life impacts of this of this, the sort of big lie of history today?
Absolutely, and it's generational in nature, and I don't see it going away until there is truth-telling and acknowledgement of our past, and that we can embrace it as part of the future. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have much poorer health outcomes than white Caucasians, and it's not all about the social determinants. It's not all about the type of job you have or whether you live in poverty. It is very much, my Aboriginal colleagues tell me, about self-respect and being believed and being understood and acknowledged for your own cultural and obvious value. And we have done such a poor job of acknowledging Aboriginality and the strength of Aboriginal people, and it's going to impact on their health until we do.
Wendy, it's interesting. I noticed that Tony Blair was saying last week, I think, that the left or progressive politics needs to understand that voters don't like their country or their flag or their history to be disrespected. Is there a way to have these conversations, to tell these truths in which people don't feel uncomfortable?
I think so. I'm just listening to the discussion tonight. You know, there's so many issues and challenges, and I think perhaps it's a case of trying to take, you know, the most important issues first, and there's a lot. I'm surprised to hear Ingrid say that, you know, you didn't learn about your own culture, your own people at university. I would have thought things might have moved on. I mean, when I was going to school, we learned about European history, and we didn't even learn about the local Indigenous people in my home area. So there's a lot of catching up to be done, and I think a lot of people would really like to understand that. And I think there's, to a certain extent, a shyness, if I can say that, or a fear of white people in Australia who know a little bit about this history but don't know enough and would really like to understand the various First Nations cultures better, and perhaps starting probably at the top with some big issues like Craig says. I can't see why you wouldn't have constitutional recognition as well. And then maybe at the local level, so that people like, you know, me, for example, from my small country community, I'm actually learning more about the people that were there first, and their culture and what they ate and did and all of that. It's really interesting.
I want to give the last 30 seconds of the program to Ingrid. Ingrid, we can rewrite the history books, but Aboriginal people would still have no guaranteed voice in the halls of power. Uluru talked about voice first, then treaty, then truth. Is that the order it needs to happen in?
It is, but I mean, the way I look at it is the kura, the yay and the Buddha. What happened in the past needs to be acknowledged. We need to look at the yay, the today of where we're actually at. Let's be honest about where we're sitting in the realm of things, the good and the bad. Let's balance it. You know, my ancestors didn't just leave me scars. They left me 60,000 years of incredible knowledge and strength. And the co-creative, collaborative future, that's where we need to be going towards. That's where the vision needs to be set.
Wonderful to hear your voice tonight and to meet you, Ingrid. Thanks so much for being part of the panel. Thanks to the other panellists and to Henry Reynolds. Good to see you again after all these years. Julia's in tomorrow. Good night.